Hi everyone, and welcome to the local foods training on winter squash. My name is Robin Kerber, and I'm the Farm and Seed to School Coordinator for the Child Nutrition Program with Maine Department of Education. And I'm happy to be offering these trainings virtually. The plan originally was to do them in person, though we have found that offering them virtually allows us to share them with a much greater audience, so it's been a lot of fun. My background is in working in restaurants. I went to school for culinary arts, and then in the last 10 plus years have worked on a variety of different farms around Maine and New England, and I'm excited to offer these trainings. So to complete this training for the additional $500 reimbursement within the local produce fund, if you're a school district, there are several steps that you need to do. First of them is to watch this video presentation in its entirety, then to download all of the recipes that go along with the culinary demo videos that we also have. There's 4 of them for winter squash. And then to email me and let me know that you've done all of this. And somewhere within this presentation, there is a challenge that you have to do, and let me know what it is so I know that you've completed this training. And so for the winter squash local foods training, we have 4 recipes for you to do, hopefully within your school kitchens. One of them comes from our Harvest of the Month fact sheet, which is shown here. And if you participate in the Harvest of the Month program, Winter Squash Month is for the month of December, though really winter squash is available through most of the winter. So it's a great local ingredient that's pretty easily accessed here in Maine. So we have the Delicata Smiles recipe from the Harvest of the Month program, and then we also have a butternut squash lasagna, a butternut squash casserole, and a Central Valley Harvest bake. So a little bit more on those recipes later on in the presentation. All right, so local winter squash. Storage crops that are available for most of the winter. So a little bit of a background on winter squash, what they are. They're part of the cucurbit family. So the squash or cucurbit family has made 3 broad contributions to human pleasure and nutrition. These are the sweet, moist melons, the sweet, starchy, nutritious winter squash that we are talking about today, and the not so sweet, moist cucumber and summer squashes. So all of those fall within the cucurbit family, and we see them available I don't want to say year-round here in Maine. I guess it depends on how long you have winter squash in storage, but you know, first cucumbers of the summer are always super exciting. We have seen more melon grown in state, which is also really exciting. I know that last summer 2020, we had a pretty bad drought. It was very dry, not a lot of rain, which actually melons do really well with those kind of conditions. So I did see a lot of really great local watermelons, honeydew, stuff like that. So that was really cool. So curing is something that we do for our winter squash. Winter squash must be cured before they're stored. This process helps to dry off excess moisture and to harden the skin, sealing out fungi and bacteria and allowing the squash to keep for a lot longer. If the weather is dry, just leave your squash on a vine and let them cure outside in the sunshine. If it's wet or turning colder, which is often the case for fall in Maine, bring the squash inside and put them somewhere warm to dry, such as a slatted greenhouse bench or a sunny window. So you can see them here. They're being stored on this surface that allows for airflow, so they're really drying. They're probably kept out of direct sunlight, and they're really just allowing the skin to harden even more, so it's going to extend the shelf life of the winter squash. Storing winter squash. Oh my gosh, winter squash. The long shelf life of winter squash means you can and you should stock up in the fall while lower prices reflect the abundance of what farmers have available. Most of the squash we buy from local farmers has been harvested and cured for up to 2 weeks, but there are some tips on how to keep them as long as possible in your kitchen. Store winter squash in a cool, dry place. They like low humidity and a temperature range of 50 to 55. So for me, I keep my house very cold. That's going to be like a kitchen cupboard. For some people, that might be down in your cellar, if you have it protected from any kind of rodents that might get into it. But 50 to 55 degrees is like the perfect storing temperature. Another tip is to remove any blossoms that might still be attached. So especially if you're getting winter squash from a local farmer, you don't often see this in the grocery store because by then they've been handled so much by the processors and the distributors that the blossom isn't going to still be there. But if you're looking at a squash, you have the stem end. The stem is typically still intact, which is a good thing. You want to see that stem still on there. If it breaks off, the shelf life is significantly decreased. And on the other end of the winter squash, you have what's called the blossom end, right, which is where that squash flower originally was. And you just really want to make sure that the blossom end, if there's still a little bit of that blossom left over, any leaves, that is removed. If the squash arrives dirty, clean with a dry towel, but do not expose them to anything wet. Once again, that will decrease the shelf life. Store on a shelf or rack, but never on the floor. And then here's just a handy little thing I made showing kind of the average storage time that these squash will really hold on to a lot of their taste and their quality. It definitely varies. There's a lot of factors that go into that, but in general, you know, your acorn and your spaghetti squash have a much thinner skin, so they're going to last really only a month. And then those other varieties really can last for up to half a year. So, but it also all depends. I mean, I've had squash last much longer than that. You kind of forget about them. And then I've also had squash where I'm surprised by how quickly they degrade. So really just keep an eye on them, but this is a great storage crop to stock up on when they're available and lower prices. All right, and there are really so many varieties of winter squash that we can choose from here in Maine. Winter squash is probably my favorite vegetable. I love just throwing the whole thing in the oven, warming it up. You know, there's so many great flavors. They often don't need much more than just like a little bit of olive oil and salt and pepper. So part of this presentation is I think it's really important that we all have a better understanding of the product knowledge of these ingredients that we're working with. So if we know more about how their flavors and their textures can vary, then we feel more comfortable utilizing them in our own kitchen and coming up with creative uses for them and recipes. The more we know, the more comfortable we are, and that's all a really good thing. So let's get into some of the varieties. Starting with the green kabocha. So this is a tried and true champion among squash. This Japanese favorite is a familiar sight for many who have frequently perused Asian produce markets. It has a green mottled skin and a sweet flesh that, when cooked, is usually thick and a bit sticky with a texture like chestnut and a faint essence of pumpkin. Roast until done, that is when a fork easily breaks the skin and slides through the squash. And you can see here a picture of it. This is a really delicious one, and we actually have part of our Harvest of the Month graphics. We hired a local artist to create some really beautiful images for us, including this squash. All right, the red kabocha is a squash like its green counterpart and has faint white stripes running from top to bottom. While the two are interchangeable, the green kabocha is relatively savory and the red kabocha is unmistakably a bit sweeter. The buttercup, compact and green with paler green striations, the buttercup can closely resemble a kabocha squash. Its distinctive bottom with a circular ridge, though, gives it away. On some, the ridge may surround a more pronounced bump, or what's called a turban. A freshly cut buttercup may smell like a clean, fragrant cucumber, because remember, they are in the same family as the cucumbers. But once cooked, its orange flesh becomes dense, a bit dry, and very mild flavored. The acorn squash. This mildly flavored squash is named for its acorn-like shape and can be found in many grocery stores. This is a pretty familiar one. We're all used to seeing this one. Choose one with a dull green rind. An acorn squash that's turned orange will have tough and fibrous flesh. And the picture here, you know, it looks like someone just kind of cut the top off and stuffed it and baked it. Acorn squash tend to be one of the smaller varieties of winter squash, so they really are great to serve whole. I'm going to talk a little bit about squash skin later, but most of these varieties you can eat the skin, but you know, peeling it is probably preferred, especially when you're serving it to school kids and children. It can be a little bit tough when you bake it, not the most pleasant thing, but certainly adds some great presentation there. Carnival squash. So when you breed an acorn squash with a sweet dumpling squash, those are two varieties, you get a carnival squash. While the carnival squash's exterior resembles both of its relatives, its yellow flesh is mellow and sweet. Use it wherever acorn squash or butternut squash is called for in a recipe. Oh, going back to this one, so we brought in a local farmer going on close to 2 years now who did a winter squash in-person demo for us. It was really fun, and he took that squash, the carnival squash, and he actually cut down those lines. You can kind of see where they indent in. There's like darker green or kind of an orange color on some of them. So he sliced it into wedges and tossed it in olive oil, salt, and pepper, baked it just like that, and you kind of ate it like you would a slice of watermelon, and it was really, really good. So that was kind of a fun, pretty easy to prep. You just follow those lines for a nice even portion, and I really like that recipe a lot. All right, and so the spaghetti squash, when I mentioned before that you can eat the skin on most of these winter squash varieties, here is your strong, this example of one that you cannot eat the skin. And if you've cooked spaghetti squash before, you might have noticed that it has a very thin, very tough skin, so you really don't want to eat that. But the spaghetti squash is a really great one for like a healthier, low carb pasta alternative. You simply bake it and you scrape out the inside, as you can see in the photo, and it has like these really long fibrous strands, which is kind of unique to the spaghetti squash. And so it's a great one to just, you know, bake up and top with some pesto or some marinara and some cheese. And you know, if you think that maybe alone it would be a little bit intimidating, try mixing the spaghetti squash with some regular noodles, some regular spaghetti, and kind of do like a 50-50. That would be really fun. This is a pretty great one. And the Blue Hubbard, another one of our beautiful harvest them on the graphics there. So most Blue Hubbard squash are huge, bumpy and lumpy, and are often sold as pre-cut wedges. And when I say huge, I mean huge. You will often find them in farm stands in the fall, and they are so huge. They're probably, you know, it seems like a stretch that it would fit in your oven. And so I had a Blue Hubbard one time that I just decided that there was no way I was ever going to be able to cut into it. I'm not really sure why I bought it. Maybe it was a gift, but it sat on my dining room table for close to 6 months, and I think I glued googly eyes to it and took a Sharpie and gave it a little face, because that Blue Hubbard squash, which I named Mama Hubbard, was just not worth the effort. But all that's to say that while they are typically the bigger varieties, go for smaller ones, and they are super delicious. The trick here is to just take that whole squash and put it in the oven. Don't even prick its skin, just put the whole thing into a really hot oven, and either cook it for maybe 20 minutes until that skin starts to kind of separate out from the flesh, then take it out. Your knife will go through it much, much easier. So that's a little bit of a trick, but the Blue Hubbard is really, really delicious and worth the effort. The red curry squash. Like all Hubbards, the red curry has an asymmetrical, lopsided look to it, and like the Blue Ballet variety, which is seen here, the red curry is smaller and a lot easier to handle. So it's a close relative to that big Mama Blue Hubbard, but it's much more manageable, has a really great taste as well. Its yellowish flesh is smooth and has a nice chestnut-like flavor. So once again, similar to the acorn in size, you can slice it, scoop out those seeds, stuff it, and it's a really great, you know, portion right there is like half of a squash. The sweet dumpling. So this beauty looks looks like some sort of heirloom cucumber with its lengthy shape and the yellow lateral ribs that run its length. It looks a lot like the carnival that we just talked about, the one where I mentioned we had that guest farmer that sliced and made really great wedges, because it is a not too distant relative from it. Baked whole, it can be served much like a baked potato. The flesh is yellowish with a sweet flavor lingering somewhere between that of zucchini and sweet potatoes. And don't worry about the skin. It is thin, delicate, and easily eaten, as is the skin of most winter, as and is easily eaten, unlike the skin of a lot of winter squash. So I call this squash, and the next one that we're going to talk about, I actually call it a fall squash. So not your summer squash like your zucchini and stuff like that, and not quite your winter squash like we've been talking about, but a fall squash, meaning that it's harvested in the fall like the winter squash, but it doesn't mature to a point where the skin is really tough and inedible, and it has a much shorter shelf life because of this, but it's really great because you don't have to spend all of that time peeling the skin. And so another example of those fall squash would be the delicata, which we're going to be doing a recipe, the delicata smiles, as part of this training. It's got that really nice thin edible skin. I love this one. Just slice it in half lengthwise, scoop out the seeds, cut it into little crescent moon shapes, toss it with just some olive oil or some regular canola oil and some seasonings. You can go savory with different herbs, salt and pepper. You could even go kind of sweet with maybe a little bit of brown sugar and cinnamon. It's very versatile. It's one of my favorite squash. Really, really good. And then the classic butternut. So a slim neck and bulbous bottom give the butternut squash its distinctive bell shape. The muted yellow-tan rind hides bright orange-yellow flesh with a relatively sweet taste. To make butternut squash easier to handle, cut the neck from the body and work with each section separately. So you can kind of see in this drawing that we have here where it does bell out towards the blossom end. So we've got the stem end at the top, blossom end at the bottom. Blossom end where it kind of is like a bulbous shape, that's going to be your seed cavity. So when you're selecting your butternut squash, you want the longer the not bulbous part moving towards the stem, the longer that part is, the more bang for your buck you're going to get, because that is solid squash. Where the bulbous part, you're going to have to scoop out those seeds. So, you know, look for a longer butternut squash. Is going to give you a lot more to work with. Awesome. So those are the different varieties that I think you're most likely going to see in your school kitchens and see available here in Maine. We certainly have dozens, if not hundreds, of other kinds that are grown by farmers, but those are kind of just like your crowd favorites. So I'm just going to talk about some basic knife skill tips and tricks. You know, when you get a big winter squash, especially if you're getting that big Mama Blue Hubbard, it can be a little bit intimidating. So really just making sure that we are set up with the proper tools, the proper workspace, and these local ingredients don't have to be intimidating at all. So number one, if you're going to use it right away, you're going to wash it. Remember I said before, if you're not going to use it right away, it comes to you a little bit dirty. Take a dry cloth, clean it off, don't get it wet, and then store it. But if you're going to use it, you want to wash it, because that knife is going to cut through that flesh, and if there's dirt on that flesh, it's going to cut right through and touch all of the inside. So really making sure it's clean is important. You want to cut it into manageable pieces. You want to peel it. So depending on the variety, depending on the size, you can either use a peeler like the white one here, or you can use a paring knife. And make sure that you're constantly cleaning your board as you go. You're chopping off the blossom end and the stem end. You're putting it to the side. You're putting it into your compost bin, wherever it's going. You're removing those seeds directly into the compost, directly into the trash. You know, if you have a clean workspace, it's just going to be, everything is going to flow much better. So a couple tricks. Trick number one. So stabilization is key. So to make sure it doesn't slide around as you're trying to cut the squash, put a damp towel underneath it first. So a damp towel underneath your cutting board. Think of this like an artist tightening his drafting board. The size of your knife matters. The size and type of your knife makes a big difference. Often I see people try and use a knife that does not have a long enough blade, so they are constantly pulling it in and out of the squash to get all the way through it. Or they use a bread knife because it seems like sawing apart will work well, not so much. So you'll have sharp edges flying around like crazy, and the squash will be wriggling like a fish. The best practice is to use a sharp, large chef's knife with at least an 8-inch blade. And the weight matters too. Be sure it's heavy and sturdy so that you're in control and not the squash. So having a heavy, long chef knife is really going to be key. Trick number 3, trim the ends first. The thickness and density of winter squash can make it a little intimidating. To set yourself up for success, trim the stem and the root ends off first before making other cuts, no matter which variety you're working with. You'll remove the toughest parts of the squash and create flat sides so you can stabilize on the cutting board without it wobbling around. Less wobbling means fewer chances for that knife to slip and cut you. So no matter what I'm working with an onion, I'm working with a squash, I'm working with anything that doesn't have flat edges, I give it flat edges. First thing I do, I cut off the ends of the onion, I cut off the ends of the squash, and that way I can rest on that cut end and it's not rolling all over the place and I'm just going to end up cutting my finger off. Trick number 4, cut vertically through the squash. So you can see in this photo here, she's already cut the ends off and she's going in with the point of the blade, making sure that she has a long enough blade to go all the way through without wiggling it all over the place. Trick number 5. So we have a melon baller, I believe, in this picture, but if you don't have a melon baller, you can certainly use just a regular spoon. The idea with the melon baller is that it has kind of sharper edges. So that's kind of the point there, is that you're really scraping out those seeds, getting into the flesh a little bit and giving it a nice, clean, hollowed area. Trick number 6. So I've mentioned this with a couple of different varieties that we went over, where sometimes if they're a little bit too big, just throw the whole thing into the oven. You run a really hot temperature, maybe like 425 degrees, and the idea here is that you're not only softening the flesh a little bit, but you're making that skin, you can see it's kind of starting to wrinkle up, really easy to peel off. Like that squash looks like I could take it out of the oven, allow it to cool a little bit, and I could just, with my hands in some gloves, just remove that skin really easily. It'll save so much time instead of peeling all of the squash. I love this trick. I do it all the time at home. And then also if the squash is really tough, you're having a hard time getting a knife through it, it'll soften up that flesh so much that you can just slice it and dice it, and then continue cooking it, because you're really just cooking it enough to soften it up, not fully at this point. All right, and as I mentioned, we've got 4 recipes that are part of this training. The butternut squash casserole, which is the one at the bottom left here. It's really delicious. We've got the squash lasagna, which is just like a classic lasagna, but we layer in slices of butternut squash. The Central Valley bake, which has got this kind of granola topping. It's the center photo here. Granola topping on top of some roasted squash and some dried fruit. That's awesome one. And then, of course, the Harvest of the Month recipe for the Delicata smiles. So I hope that everybody downloads these recipes, watches our guest chef demonstrate how to cook them, and you use them in your own school kitchens. And speaking of our guest chef, so for this series, we brought in guest chef Keith Giles. Keith was our guest chef. He came to our Augusta culinary classroom and prepared the recipes that are part of this training. Keith is a farm-to-table chef at the River Room at the Maine local market in Hollowell, Maine. He graduated from the farm-to-table culinary program at Kennebec Valley Community College, where he was the first culinary student to complete the honors program. He has a passion for creating great food and teaching people how to cook healthy. Keith teaches a variety of healthy cooking classes at Maine General Hospital and serves safe to new culinary students at Kennebec Valley Community College. So it was great to work with Keith on these recipes. All right, and that wraps up our educational presentation part of this culinary training. So you've done that. Please, like I said, watch the culinary demo videos, download those recipes, use them in your kitchen, find a local farmer where you can buy some great winter squash from, and email me that you have completed all of that. There's my email right there, robin.kerber@maine.gov. Let me know you finished it. And here's the little trick to know if you really got this far in the presentation or you're just telling me. Tell me how your kitchen has used winter squash. All right. So thank you everybody for your time. I hope that you learned some things here. I hope that you're excited to test out some of those knife skills, try some different varieties, get creative with the winter squash in your kitchen. And of course, let me know if you need help finding local squash from a farmer here in Maine. Let me know if you have any great recipes you want me to share, anything at all. I always love hearing from you guys, and I appreciate everybody's time.